Some of those constants you've heard me mention. One, of course, which is very important, which we see operating in Africa today, which we've seen operating in Panama, in Grenada, and which will operate in the future on the African continent and other places where African people are, is what we call the military differential. With Europeans, who are 10% of the population, their continued dominance rests on their maintaining superior military force. In fact, to a great extent, our being over here today is the result of military differences. There is no intention for the Europeans to equalize that differential between Africans and themselves. That differential has been there since we met them, and it has really not changed up to this very moment. And we see it operating in Africa at this very moment. And there is the intention that it will continue to operate in the world. Hidden behind this intentionality are a lot of glorious looking things, such as non-proliferation treaties. The treaty that Bush just signed with Yeltsin, perpetrated in the name of peace, when it is nothing more than an intention to maintain European power by limiting the growth of military power on the part of non-European people. It has nothing to do with peace. It has to do with maintaining superiority and white supremacy in the world. So we must not be deceived by these games. To maintain, the European, of course, has all intentions to maintain the economic differential. There is no intention for the European to see Africans as equally, economically equal with them, no matter what the talk is about. There is every intention for the European to continue to exploit African natural and human resources, no matter in what guise, even though he may appoint African so-called leaders and support African regimes. The intention is the same as it always has been, to maintain economic advantage of African people, to maintain the technological differential. These are constants. And we saw European technology as it was used against our ancestors. The intention is that it will be used in the future as it is used now. The Europeans intend to maintain the power of definition, which we'll talk about tonight, because special education, as we will talk about shortly, is a definition. And as I said, I think earlier today, before we get involved in a discussion of special education, we should ask, why have we permitted the Europeans to define what it is? Why do they have the power to do so, and why do we submit to their definition of our behavior as a people? So before you get caught up in the intricacies of whether tests can differentiate between the learning disabled and the non-disabled, you should ask first questions first. Who determines it? And why are they able to impose their determination on us as a people? It is through then defining the world, as we will elaborate, that the European manipulates the world and maintains his power in it. And therefore he intends to maintain that power of definition. He intends to maintain control of the domain of discourse. A great deal of the discussion today over the various kinds of curricula, the multicultural curriculum, the curriculum of inclusion, the African-centered curriculum, and so forth, are struggles with the European over who will define what it is important to talk about. What shall be taught and what shall not be taught. What people shall learn and not learn. What educational experience shall people undergo and not undergo? Because all of these are related to power and to power relations. And therefore, if the European is intending to maintain power and control of the world, he must seek to maintain control over the domain of discourse, to decide what is worth talking about, to decide what is news, to decide the subject matter of curricula of various types. There are other areas, the area, of course, of always making those things African secondary to those things European. These constants were there from the beginning, they are here now, and there's every intention for them to remain in the future. Despite the elevation of blacks to high-level jobs, despite, some amounts of assimilationism, and despite some multiculturalism into schools and so forth, these intentions remain the same. And it becomes very important for you to watch the changes and how they maintain these things. Because if you are to gain power in the world, it must be these very things which must be changed, ladies and gentlemen. The education of Africans has always revolved around education for servitude. That has not changed one whit. I have warned in Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children that the main purpose of education is not preparing black children for jobs. It is not preparing them to work for white folk. That is not the main purpose of the education of our children or our people. For if that is our main purpose, then it means another constant has remained in the world, and that's the constant of slavery under a different name. Now it's called looking for a job, with the same people having the jobs and the same people determining our wages. If you're talking about true change in the world, then you must educate yourself to create your own jobs and to employ yourself. But today, education for blacks, I don't care how high it is essentially still being defined in terms of servitude. And we think, when we are educated, in terms of how and where we will be employed by Europeans. That has to change. But the education of black people from 1619 right to this very moment has had this as a central tenet: training black folk to serve white folks' interest. Training black folk to be as productive as possible for Europeans, with the Europeans owning the means of production. Education that was separate and unequal. And believe me, I'm not an advocate of integrated education. Education that was ultimately and is ultimately degrading to black people has not changed. It was that way from the beginning, and is that way right now. Education that ultimately insults the history and culture of African people. Education that is Eurocentric, meaning an education that prepares black people to maintain European power as the central power in the world. Education of black people according to the white man's estimation of black intelligence and his need to shape and direct it. I've warned you before that you need to change the definition of intelligence before you get into an argument with Europeans as to whether their tests are measuring intelligence or not. You must ask, what is the political function of your definition of intelligence? What is the political economy of your definition of intelligence? And why is it that the way you define intelligence always ends up that means intelligent people work for you and your interest? So consequently then, we must recognize as an African people that the ultimate goal of intelligence must be that of preparing a people to solve their problems